Romney and Bain Capital. There's a lot of accusations against Mitt Romney in this short movie, and some of them are true, some of them are false. They're not. It's a complex subject about what really went on. On the one hand, Mitt Romney did create some jobs with his venture capital part of the company. His company did venture capital, and they also did private equity deals. Okay, the difference between venture capital deals and private equity is that the venture capital deals were funding new companies or companies that were starting out and needed funds to get started or to continue functioning. And as a venture capital company, they would just invest funds into these companies for a percentage of for shares for a percentage of the company. So the venture capital tended to be productive, create jobs. On the other hand, the private equity deals were a totally different animal. The private equity deals were a function of the cheap money available on Wall Street. And the reason this cheap money was available was because the Federal Reserve had kept interest rates too low for many years. Increasingly, the interest rates have fallen over time, not increased. As we got into the 2000s, interest rates got even lower. But the Federal Reserve, through their easy money policies, induced hedge funds, which Bain Capital basically functioned as a hedge fund type of company. They were able to access large sums of funds, to borrow large sums of funds from investors, from banks, and they took these large funds and they used those funds to buy going businesses. They would buy these companies, these businesses that were already operating, and many of them may have been they may have been making money, or they might have been having financial problems as well. Some of them were making money, so they would buy these companies and then they would attempt to slash costs, reorganize them, and they would, when they purchased these companies, they would use the assets they're purchasing as the collateral for the loans. So after they purchased them, they would try to slim them down, cut costs, however they could. So it may have led to some of the companies being able to continue in business from the standpoint of costs were being cut. The companies may have been troubled, and costs needed to be cut. But at the same time, some of these companies they basically went into disarray because of the cuts. I mean, Bain had large sums of money at their disposal. They bought these companies, and not everything they did made sense. So their access to these large sums of money enabled them to do things that they probably shouldn't have done and that weren't justified from a business standpoint. And this movie it has several examples in it, and some of them are good examples, some of them aren't. We came up with a couple examples that weren't in the movie, because some of these companies were actually bought and sold after Mitt Romney had already left the company, though Mitt Romney does continue to receive payouts from Bain Capital. And here there's an example. Romney's Bain Capital, they bought Georgetown Steel, and they doubled their money on GS Industries, Georgetown Steel. And under their leadership, it says they cut more than 1,750 jobs, shuttered a division that had been around for 100 years, and eventually sank into bankruptcy. Bain spent $24 million to acquire GS Industries, and they made $58.4 million off its investment. Then it says Bain partners earned multi-million-dollar dividends from GS Industries and annual management fees of $900,000 a year. And it says by the time GS Industries filed for bankruptcy protection in 2001, it owed $553 million in debts against assets valued at only $395 million. So they bought the company, and ultimately the company went bankrupt. That's the problem. And Mitt Romney, it says, was in charge of Bain for most of the time that they owned GS Industries. So basically what happened is that they took on a lot of debt to buy the companies, and the debt was backed by the company's assets, and in some cases the debt was too much for the revenue that the company was producing, but also they didn't they may have been taking out too much in dividends and causing the company, they're basically just using the company as a profit machine. You buy the company, you suck it dry, and then you say so long. Let the company go into bankruptcy or whatever. So, private equity used properly can be productive if it's a company that was in trouble, and then if you properly manage the company that you're buying. But some of the deals, they weren't really handled properly, and they caused these companies to go bankrupt. It says here, Bain Capital came to own Georgetown Steel after it provided the financing for a management-led buyout of Armco Worldwide Grading Systems of Kansas City, Missouri in 1993. The Armco plant was renamed GS Technologies, was merged with Georgetown Industries in 1995 to become GS Industries Incorporated. At the time, the combined entities headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, had $1 billion in revenue, employed 3,800 people worldwide. Sanderson said Bain Capital replaced longtime managers who had built Georgetown Steel with Bain. They replaced them with bean counters, looking for ways to cut costs. They demanded increased financial performance with little idea of how the daily operations were run. They say they were investors, they weren't steel mill operators. Of course, Mitt Romney would dispute that characterization, but that doesn't change the fact the company did actually file for bankruptcy. And there were a lot of problems in the steel industry, so that could have been a factor, obviously. But ultimately, the company did file for bankruptcy. And Bain Capital made money on the deal, but the company ultimately went bankrupt. So you have to wonder if it was really a productive deal. How is it that they were able to borrow the money to buy the company, and then in the end the company had to file for bankruptcy? So that's where the vulture capitalist, calling him a vulture capitalist, that's where that term comes in. So, I mean, this deal doesn't look good. It says here, Bain Capital propped up short-term earnings. So the venture capital firm would borrow money that went towards investors' dividends, enriching themselves, Bain Capital, but leaving the companies with unsustainable debt. So when they borrowed the debt, the companies had to service that debt that Bain Capital borrowed. And then they would attempt to cut expenses so they could extract profits, but that may have been at the expense of long-term viability of these companies. And then Mitt Romney said, I think 40 mills went bankrupt the same time GS Industries did, in part because of, well, in this case, dumping from places like China into this country. So he's trying to lay the blame on foreign imports. And then there was another company, GS Industries bought. They paid $10 million to buy another South Carolina company, Gaffney-based photo album maker Holson Burns Group. And the prospectus for this company shows Bain Capital Partners made more than twice their earnings, twice their investment, earning $22 million. You invest $10 million, make $22 million. Okay. But what happened to the company? It says Holson Burns Group went out of business and 150 people lost their jobs. So we don't have the details of the specifics on that deal. But it doesn't look good because the company went out of business. But we don't have any specifics. Okay, and then goes on to say about going back to the Georgetown Steel GS Industries case, saying that Bain nearly destroyed a Georgetown steel plant that had provided hundreds of well-paying jobs to Georgetown County residents since the late 60s. According to Sanderson, who has remained president of the local United Steelworkers of America Union 78-98, through a pair of bankruptcies, a mill shutdown, and a rebirth under Mitel Steel in 2005. Says less than a year after taking controlling interest in the Georgetown plant, Bain Capital cut the employees' profit-sharing plan twice, lowering the plant's hourly rate from $5.60 an hour to $1.25 per hour. Most of the workers didn't learn about the cuts until they received their paychecks. And then the profit-sharing checks eventually totally disappeared. And then Sanderson agrees that China's cheap steel imports on the American marketplace hurt Georgetown Mill's production and profitability. But then he makes the point, if Bain Capital had only invested in the mill instead of taking everything from it, we would have been able to sustain that the dumping like we had in the past. Basically saying that the lack of investment made them unable to compete. And then GS Industries applied for a federal loan in 1999 to help keep the company afloat, but in 2001, before the loan could be used, GS Industries filed for bankruptcy protection. And the Georgetown steel plant was put out of bankruptcy for $53 million by Midcoast Industries in 2002, but the mill continued to struggle and filed for bankruptcy protection again in 2003. Steel mill closed with that bankruptcy, putting its more than 450 employees out of work. Then the former International Steel Group purchased the remains of Georgetown Steel the following year for $18 million and reopened the mill. Then in 2005, Mitel Steel, now ArcelorMittal, bought the International Steel Group, making Georgetown a part of its operations. The Georgetown mill now employs about 300 million. So the problem is that they went bankrupt after Romney was running it. Romney took over, the Bain Capital took it over, may have ran it into the ground. We don't really know absolutely what transpired, but we do know they went bankrupt after they were purchased by Bain Capital. In the years afterwards, finally they couldn't survive and they went bankrupt. And then they went through a number of sales. And then finally, ISG, the International Steel Group, bought it. And then International Steel was bought out by another company. And now the steel mill is back up and running, employing 300 people. So the question is, if Accelera or Mitel can run the company now profitably, then why is it that it went bankrupt previously after it was bought out by Bain Capital? It sounds like a case of Bain took too much. They took the profits out. They cut everything to the bone, the reinvestment, and the company couldn't survive any longer. So that doesn't sound like a good deal for the company. It sounds like vulture capital. The vulture capital, those private equity deals funded by the Federal Reserve, not directly, but the easy money policies of the Federal Reserve enabled these private equity firms to buy out companies with relatively small sums of money. They would leverage relatively small sums of money and then buy out these companies, and then in some cases mismanage them and put too much debt on their books, and then the companies couldn't survive, and then they would have to file for bankruptcy. And this Georgetown Steel deal sounds like one of them. And then there's this article in the Washington Post, the fact checker by the Washington Post, and it's a number. They examine the deals in the video, and they seem to basically, some of the deals, the Washington Post fact checker seems to want to gloss them over. It goes over the closure of the Unimac plant in Marietta, Florida. is saying 3 former employees of Unimac, which makes commercial washing machines, appear to suggest the quality went down under Bain Capital's management, and that a plant in Marianna, Florida was closed down because of Romney's actions. And saying the chronology of the deal was all jumbled in the movie, saying Bain Capital bought the business from Raytheon in '98, and Romney left Bain a year later to run the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. 2005, Bain sold Unimac to a Canadian entity known as Teachers Private Capital, and the factory down there in Florida was moved to Ripon, Wisconsin in 2006 after Bain's involvement ended. So in the movie they don't mention that the factory was closed in Florida, but the factory was actually moved to Wisconsin and continues to this day apparently. So that deal may not have really been a bad deal in itself. Um, and then it talks about, yeah, I mean the film gives the impression that Unimac went out of business, which they didn't go out of business at all. So that part of the movie is just totally misleading. And then let's move on to the bankruptcy of KB Toys. It says Bain Capital did not buy KB Toys until late 2000, more than a year after Romney left for the Olympics. But the film states Romney and Bain bought the 80-year-old company in 2000, loaded it with millions in debt. It then attributes the failure of KB Toys in 2008 to that debt load, particularly without noting that a horrible retail environment wiped out a number of chains, particularly toy stores. The segment also misquotes an article from the Boston Herald, making it appear as if the newspaper editorialized that Romney and Bain made disgusting profits, but the quote actually was from a former worker who had been laid off at KB Toys. So Mitt Romney may not have been, he wasn't at Bain any longer, though he does continue to receive profits to this day from them. But let's look at it more closely, even though he wasn't technically still employed by Bain, even though he does get paid by them. This article from the Wall Street Journal goes over the KB Toys deal. It says here, Bain Capital took control of KB Toys in 2000, putting up only $18 million. It financed much of the rest of the $300 million purchase price by loading up the company with debt. It all worked out well for Bain Capital, which in April 2002 collected a $120 million dividend after only 16 months. So they invested $18 million and made $121 million in 18 months. But this is in a KB Toys debt holder made some kind of court filing claiming that they had taken out the $121 million dividend and then left them holding worthless debt. But it says, well, KB Toys was struggling to compete against volume sellers like Walmart stores, and they couldn't recover because of all the debt. I mean, the toy business was changing, and they were under such a big debt load taken out by Bain Capital, and they couldn't support the debt plus make the necessary changes in the business to continue making money. So then In 2004, KB Toys filed for Chapter 11. So the debt holders' court filing with the bankruptcy court in Delaware alleges that the rich dividend payout plunged the company into bankruptcy. A Bain spokesman declined to comment on the matter, but an outside advisor to the company said KB Toys was healthy when the dividend was paid, and it was just bad luck that it ran into trouble later. I don't know how correct that is. I mean, you put in $18 million, you invest $18 million, and in 2002 they got 121 million in dividend payments. Bain got 121 million. 2002, and then 2 years later they filed for bankruptcy protection. And then an outside consultant says it's all normal. I mean, 121 million. They purchased a company for 300. They purchased a company for 300 million, and then in 16 months they make 120 million. They make 121 million, and then 2 years later the company goes bankrupt. It just doesn't sound totally kosher. You buy a company for 300 million, you make 120 million, then 2 years later the company files for bankruptcy. You make a third. You take out a third of the purchase price in profits. You invest 300 million. Within 16 months, you've taken back out 121 million, and then 2 years later, your company goes bankrupt. Just doesn't. No, that doesn't sound right. I'm saying. No. And Bain refuses to comment. I wonder why. No, Mitt Romney wasn't still working for Bain technically at that time. But I don't want to just. This isn't the point here. Isn't just to address Mitt Romney involvement with the company, but also private equity. These private equity deals in general. And it goes on to say here that with so many private equity deals these days, the KB Toys case is being watched carefully. The dividend payment that Bain received isn't unusual. That's what it says. Probably wasn't unusual at that time. Still, investors who buy debt in ailing companies like KB Toys are increasingly blaming the return-obsessed private equity firms for paying themselves handsomely and leaving their portfolio companies struggling with substantial debts and vulnerable to an economic slowdown. So, I mean, they're actually being sued. Some of the debt holders are suing to attempt to recover some of their losses. It says the merits of the KB Toys case will take months to resolve, but there have been instances in the recent past where creditors' complaints have forced buyout firms to put money back into insolvent portfolio companies. Many lawyers and restructuring experts expect that conflicts similar to the KB Toys dispute will pick up in coming months, especially if debt financing gets more difficult. You'll see enormous amount of litigation because there have been so many leveraged dividend deals. The past few years have been rewarding for buyout firms. They have bought companies using masses of debt, and no sooner is a deal done than they put more debt on their new acquisitions and use the proceeds to pay themselves dividends taking most of their cash off the table in the process. So the equity companies get all their money back that they invested, and the companies are left with a debt, some of them go bankrupt as a result. And it says here, and obliging lenders have allowed the buyout funds, the private equity companies, to pile ever more debt on their companies. These days, lenders seem untroubled if the buyout firms borrow 80% of the purchase price, borrow an additional 20% 3 months later, and then do a third refinancing to pay themselves a dividend. So that it's not a true. That's not a true dividend. That's you borrow money against a company that you've already bought. You borrow more money and then you take the money out. That's not a true dividend. That's not coming from profits. You're just borrowing money based on the collateral of the company. That's not profits. And it says it's an advantage to do a dividend deal and take money out. They're calling it a dividend deal, but that's not a dividend. Since there are good reasons for David Friedman, a senior partner with the law firm Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman, there are good reasons for a private equity firm to put in as little as possible and take out as much as they can in order to improve their return on equity. They can always put more cash into the company later. I mean, the later, I don't know when the later is. The company goes bankrupt. That's not helpful. And it says, these days with capital so plentiful, the capital coming from the Federal Reserve, which has enabled the low interest rates, it says with capital so plentiful and increasing competition for buyout candidates, the buyout firms are stacking risks. That is, financial risk on top of operational risk on top of industry risk to a greater degree than they have in the past to get returns. It says, for 2005, nearly half of all low-grade debt issuance is tied to the buyout firms. Almost 40% of all lower-rated high-yield or junk debt has gone to fund buyouts, and nearly 10% more has gone to paying dividends to their owners. They keep calling it dividends, but it's not dividends. Because it isn't always easy for creditors to pry money out of private equity firms in bankruptcy court battles. For a start, the buyout firms usually get so-called solvency opinions, as Bain did for KB Toys. These opinions state that at the time the company could afford to pay off the debt, so that if there is a default later, the directors are liable. Lawyers who dispute these cases, though, often say such opinions are meaningless. So there you have it. We already have a couple deals that they just didn't really make sense. You buy a company and you take over $100 million out of it, and then within 2 years later, company goes bankrupt, and then you claim that it's due to competition. So that's how it works. That's how the private equity industry works. So the venture capital half of Bain Capital was productive. The private equity half, many of the deals were destructive. And then this video, the problem with the video is
capitalism made America great. Free markets.
It's a lot of
he's for small businesses. No, he isn't.
there are a lot of personal stories.
You're
and
going to be on the hit
attacks
list, you know that.
on Mitt
Took
Romney.
foreign seed money from Latin America and began a pattern exploiting dozens of
So saying he took some investments from overseas, attacking that. I don't know what the bad part is. Foreign company investing money in the U.S. That isn't necessarily a negative. So that's the part where the movie comes across as anti-capitalist.
American businesses.
They fire people, they cut benefits, they sell assets.
But okay, let's look deeper. Let's look deeper in his life. What did he do when he was...
Yeah, I mean, some of that, I mean, it is true. They bought these companies, they fired people, etc. They had access to millions of dollars. They bought the companies, and then they didn't properly restructure the companies. There was such a rush to take funds out that it caused the companies in the end to go bankrupt.
He had a Harvard pedigree, and he was on a tear, making spectacular returns.
More personal attacks, Harvard pedigree, blah, blah, blah.
You know, I just wish they'd left us alone back in the early 90s and we'd be making a lot of washing machines and good ones.
If they would just...
Okay, this is the Unimac deal. Unimac didn't actually close up. It probably did have a very negative impact on the company, on the city in Florida, where the plant was closed. We don't know the details of why they closed up in Florida and moved it up to Wisconsin. But the company stuff continues in business. So that wasn't a really good example for this film. The Georgetown Steel deal would have been a much better choice.
I was stressed out all the time because I never knew if I was going to have a job when I came in the next day. And we had insurance.
It was really scary. So
Romney and Bain upended the company and gutted the workforce. Now they were ready to make a handsome profit.
They did sell us. We were sold to
Teachers union out of Canada. What does teachers know about wash machines?
Romney and Bain's sale to the Canadians netted a whopping 230% profit for Romney and his investors. The deal left behind a trail of wreckage.
I'm convinced that if you want to create jobs, it helps to have had a job. And I've had jobs. And I'll use that experience to help America.
they never could get enough. No matter how much no matter.
Your whole lifestyle changed because you're making this.
Where are you gonna find the hottest toys? On the planet Mars? No!
Okay, this is the KB Toys deal.
Hot we got at KB Toys.
Romney and Bain bought the 80-year-old company in 2000, loaded KB Toys with millions of debt, then used the money to repurchase Bain's stock. The debt was too staggering. By 2004, 365 stores had closed.
All the latest toys to choose from. Hot we got at KB.
The company is shutting down all of its stores.
The Attorney General is advising people to cash in those cards as soon as possible. As we told you just yesterday, the toy chain has filed for bankruptcy.
Romney called it creative destruction.
Creative destruction does enhance productivity. For an economy to thrive, and as ours does, there are a lot of people who will...
Okay. You know, he's talking about the creative destruction. I mean, there is creative destruction. It's just that his creative destruction is financed through easy credit by our Federal Reserve not through the free market. These private equity deals couldn't happen unless the government created the easy money that his companies like his could access and borrow millions to buy companies. They take advantage of these large sums and do creative destruction that should never happen. Let's go back to the video.
Suffer as a result of that.
Romney and other top executives take $120 million. By 2009, the debt accumulated under Romney was too great. KB Toys was no more.
Make a profit. That's the name of the game, right?
Mitt Romney and Bain saw a 900% return on their investment. Romney and Bain's profits, at the expense of 15,000 jobs, was described by the Boston Herald as disgusting.
Mitt Romney's campaign boasts of the jobs the Republican presidential candidate created while running private equity firm Bain Capital. What it doesn't talk about is Romney's experience eliminating jobs.
Under Romney, Bain was making billions, at the same time contributing to the greatest American job loss since World War II. It was called the Bain Way, contributing to the greatest American job loss since World War II. It was called the Bain Way. Romney's Bain employees were quickly fired in order to pump up profits. Helped by a favorable rating from Bain's Wall Street friends, DDI, a 12 million share IPO, raised a quick $170 million. People were buying into the promise that DDI was headed to become a billion-dollar company. Then, instead of sticking with the stock, Bain dumped it. Just after 6 months, Bain sold shares, making $39 million. Then they dumped the rest, just 4 months later, collecting $54 million more. All the while, the Wall Street banks they hired gave cover, issuing glowing reports. DDI ended up losing $400 million. A little over 2 years later, the stock was nearly worthless. The result? DDI filed for bankruptcy. 2,100 jobs were lost.
Okay.
Average investor.
That's DDI.
Insider connections.
There's a company DDI, and they did an IPO. The company went public, and then a short time after they went public, Bain dumped their shares, and then the investors on Wall Street who bought the DDI shares, not knowing that the stock was going to go down to zero. These people lost their money, so the employees lost their jobs, and many investors lost millions of dollars in the IPO. It says here,
losing $400 million. A little over 2 years later, the stock was nearly worthless.
Okay.
The result? DDI filed for bankruptcy.
Within 2 years. Within 2 years, the company had filed for bankruptcy. So that's another deal. That wasn't a good deal, not at all, for employees or the investors, except for Bain Capital. And this Washington Post article basically glosses over the bankruptcy of DDI. It says the segment tries to tie Romney to Wall Street games playing by focusing on allegations that Lehman Brothers pumped up the stock of DDI, allowing Bain Capital to sell its shares for big gains, even while Lehman analysts had misgivings about the Orange County electronics maker. According to an August 26, 2003 account, which the film cites as a source, Bain Capital under Romney's leadership invested $46 million in DDI in 1997. It sold many of its shares for at least $93 million and received a $10 million management fee. But the newspaper said Bain retained a 14% stake in the firm that was wiped out when DDI filed for bankruptcy during the dot-com bust. But the film suggests Bain had sold all of its shares, which apparently wasn't the case. So there was the video wasn't totally correct. And then it says Lehman Brothers in 2003 paid $80 million to settle charges by the SEC that its bankers had tainted stock recommendations in 5 instances, including recommendations for DDI. But the SEC did not say that Bain had done anything wrong. Romney, who again was by then involved in the Olympics, also invested some of his own money in DDI and sold it before the stock crashed, the Boston Globe reported in 2003. The video, while focusing on the 2,200 jobs that were lost during the technology bust, does not mention that DDI emerged from bankruptcy proceedings and is currently thriving. So, it just seems like the Washington Post is trying to gloss it over. The fact is, they did an IPO, and within 2 years, the company went bankrupt. It is a pattern. You have Georgetown Steel, you have KB Toys, and you have this company DDI. So it's not entirely a good record, and points to the problem with these private equity deals. So this is the problem. Go back to the video.
1,100 jobs were lost. Average investors without insider connections were left with huge losses. Romney denies being involved with the controversial deal, claiming to have left Bain to lead the 2002 Olympic Organizing Committee.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Mitt Romney, et je suis président.
But SEC filings prove otherwise.
I don't know what Mitt Romney speaking French has to do with it.
During the DDI deal, Romney is listed as a member of the management committee of Bain Capital, with control of over 1.3 million shares of DDI Corporation. Sure enough, the probe uncovered evidence that Lehman Brothers continued to encourage investors to buy DDI stock, even though they had misgivings themselves. Romney's Bain Way model played out over and over. Employees, creditors, and investors were hurt. Creditors and investors were hurt. But not Bain. Even though time and time again thousands of jobs were lost, investors and creditors were out hundreds of millions. Romney and Bain made piles of money. The vicious cycle would play itself out this time in America's heartland.
Marion used to be such a booming town.
We used to be a town full of it.
Marion used to be such a booming town.
1992, an interesting prospect appeared on the Romney-Bain radar. A paper company called AMPAD with plants in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Buffalo, New York, and Marion, Indiana. The potential was there for Romney and his investors to reap a bonanza of cash, perhaps over $100 million.
I think this company knew when they come in, they had no intention of keeping us.
And they told us we'd been bought by AMPAD and that we were all fired. Well, they said Ampad Corporation, but the guy that was in charge of the Ampad Corporation at that time was Mitt Romney.
I was pregnant at the time, and at the meeting they told everybody that we were all fired, that we had to reapply for our jobs. We made appointments to do this hiring process. We went in and interviewed, and they would let us know.
Okay, so they're talking about Ampad. And this Washington Post article explores the what happened to Ampad. It says Bain assembled Ampad through what is known as a roll-up strategy, in which similar companies are purchased in the same industry. One of these companies was the writing product from SCM, based in Marion, which was purchased in 1994. The efficiencies of scale at first proved a success, and Bain made a fortune of $100 million. But the company ultimately floundered, ironically because of price pressure from companies such as Staples, which was started with help from Bain. And Ampad filed for bankruptcy protection in 1999, but still exists as part of the Asselt Corp. One former Ampad employee claims Romney has 15 homes. He actually only has 3. Nothing to do with Ampad, but that was totally extraneous information about how many houses the man owns. So in that way, the parts of the film come across as being just attacking Mitt Romney's wealth. But this is, moreover, without evidence, the film claims that tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs because of actions taken by Romney and Bain Capital. I don't know. We don't have an exact number how many jobs were lost, but just in these few examples, it is obvious that many jobs were lost. So there we have it. Thanks for watching.